Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 9th episode of Host the Pro, where disruptive influencers talk about e-commerce marketing. Today we have Scott Lux with us. Hey, Scott.
Hello. Good morning, good afternoon.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon to you too. How are you today?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
Amazing. So Scott is an e-commerce marketing veteran, and he will share a lot of his experience. And let us hear about this experience just before we dive into all those tips.
Yeah, sure. I started my digital career back in Seattle, the first .com boom, and I've always been passionate about technology. But I had the opportunity to work on the agency side. So started my real digital career, if you will, running account strategy for a small agency called Zaz at the time. We were acquired by Wunderman Thompson, which is part of the WPP family, for those of you that follow the hierarchy of agency life. What was great about that role is we were one of the very first agencies to really look at data and analytics. And so before we would put pen to paper, do any creative, we would always take a look at, okay, what are the success metrics? How do we measure those? And how do we optimize if it's not working well, or how do we celebrate the success if it's working well? And that was back in the early 2000s, and it stuck with me throughout my career. One of the things that was interesting on the agency side is when we were first starting in digital, most of our sites were really experiential marketing focused, but we were still driving to another channel. So we may do this beautiful website, create engagement. Social was just starting to take off a little bit, but it was still drive to store, drive to another channel. When I moved to New York around 2008 after we got acquired, I started to see the second shift within the digital world where brands, smaller mid-size, if you will, some of the bigger players had already been e-commerce enabled. We're starting to move to commerce enablement. They were finally starting to realize, okay, this e-commerce thing, we really should pay attention to it. And I had the opportunity to work with Demandware and Salesforce and launch a couple of key brands in their e-commerce infrastructure. So my role mainly pivoted from the agency side, went to work on the brand side, where I was the general manager owning the P&L, so focused on digital marketing, operations, and site experience for brands such as Diesel, John Varvatos, Intermix, which is owned by Gap, as well as Theory, Analysis, and Olivia. And then most recently, I decided to make the pivot, still staying within commerce, but moving a little bit out of retail to a social commerce startup called NowWith. So that's a very, very fast and high-level view of my digital journey, if you will.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing. It's an amazing journey, and I think it kind of flows with the journey that digital marketing is kind of in general goes through, right? And today, and there were so many changes throughout that journey of digital marketing as a whole, and specifically for e-commerce. And today, everyone is hysteric about the Facebook changes with the iOS 14 update and everything that's going on there. So it's kind of the latest change that happened, and it very much relates to your last step going into social commerce and everything that has to do with that. Can you explain why did you do the move, and how does it relate to the changes happening today?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate timing with some of the changes. I think when e-commerce first started out, again, 10 to 15 years, I think there was a lot of debate. One, some of the early conversations I was having with bigger brands is like, oh, this is going to be a lower cost channel for us to operate. Second, it was still kind of treated by a lot of brands as a hobby. But what you started to see probably about 5 or 10 years ago is a shift where the technology started to grow pretty fast, where you now had these SaaS-based platforms, Demandware, Magento. Then you started to see Shopify come into the mix. So you started to open up this entirely new ecosystem. At the same time, costs of data were going up. So the management part of e-commerce, while I think unlocked a lot of capabilities, became expensive.
Yeah.
But with that, DTC brands were able to launch in a way they couldn't before. The old retail model was you had to get distribution through wholesale partners because it was too expensive to launch on an ATG or Salesforce. Shopify kind of unlocked that a bit. And you also had really cheap media. So I think that was the other component 5 years ago with Facebook, and we'll get to where this comes together in a moment. But that was the idea. You could launch targeted campaigns, cast a wide net with Facebook lookalike audiences. You could do similar approach with Google. So a lot of DTC brands, Caspers of the world, Allbirds, were able to get really, really quick traction and audience and awareness. Suddenly, within COVID and the pandemic, you started to see you had these DTC brands, you had kind of traditional brands, but more and more brands were like, wait a second, we've got to increase our e-commerce because that's where everything is. And we've got to start letting customers know we have these features, functionality during the pandemic. So they started to spend quite a bit more. And the cost of media started to almost skyrocket. What I experienced at Theory and Allison Olivia is we almost saw a doubling of the media costs over a year time period. So it got to this point where the return on investment wasn't sustainable. So you had that first headwind, and then second, you had the iOS changes with privacy coming up, where I think right now the latest stat I've seen, about 95% of users have turned on privacy. And so no longer can brands have this easy access to do lookalike targeting. So I think that's where it's kind of come to a head, and why I'm optimistic. I do think with brands, the challenge but the opportunity is to leverage first-party data. And I think that's where you start getting into social commerce. And really the biggest challenge, what we kicked off our conversation around, is a lot of times brand and marketers try to change customer behavior and direct them to go transact somewhere else. And I think we're finally realizing, if you are on TikTok or Snap or YouTube or a direct site or physical retail, let the customer transact where it's most convenient for them.
Yeah. And it is a challenge, right? I mean, you say, hey, your customers or potential customers has their own journey. Be yourself as a native part of that journey instead of interrupting and directing them into your course. But how do you do it? I mean, it seems so complex. And how do you become native of this journey?
Yeah, I think it goes back to really looking at foundational principles around customer experience. And the way I define that is looking at digital, physical, and people. And that really encompasses, I think, how a brand will manifest and move throughout that ecosystem. So I think the first step is recognizing those three pillars, if you will, are critically important to a brand's success. The second component is you have to do research. You have to understand what are the customer journeys and actually map those out. So if you are a fashion brand trying to acquire new customers, map out what is that customer journey for your target audience. And you would be surprised on the path that they take. We all know it's not linear and bounces around quite a bit, but then you can map out the touch points, and you can understand which ones are critical to the customer's success or failure within that journey, and focus on solving or putting your attention in those key areas. So for example, if discoverability is now being pushed to social, which I believe it is based on influencer marketing, then that's probably one of the key areas you should look to focus on. And then looking at, okay, where does the transaction happen? How do we stay in touch and continue to message to that customer so that it makes it easy for them to interact with the brand?
Yeah. And, after a research like that, which would probably be, more than just, going through the web, or, we don't have the tracking option anymore. So it would be, brands will actually need to speak with customers and also ask them some questions, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where, you've had like NPS, Net Promoter Scores, kind of been a benchmark for a while. But I think brands will really start to focus in on how do you measure customer satisfaction? How do you do NPS at kind of a journey or touch point level instead of in aggregate? I think it'll force brands to look at more quantitative and qualitative research, really understanding the macro trends that are impacting potentially their vertical, the market, but also doing research on their own customers, which, as you alluded to, I think a lot of brands don't take advantage of it.
Yeah.
It's really easy to deploy a simple survey. You can do post-purchase questions. You can actually, now that things are opening back up, shadow customers in store. You can track them online just by doing heat mapping. So there's certain ways you can start to kind of elicit some of that data that'll help inform the direction you should take and what your customers are actually doing.
What would be a question or a surprising question which are not the direct question everyone will think of that you think should be part of that research?
Oh gosh, there's probably a lot, and I would say, it depends. But I think really, NPS, kind of the classic question is, would you recommend X brand to a friend or family? And I think you can do that in aggregate or based on a journey or transactional point. So it could be you walked into a store and asked that question, or it could be you made a simple purchase or you received an email and you can start to target. But that's a very, very high level. I would say it also depends on what you're trying to uncover within that particular behavior. So it could be, what other brands you purchase from? Have you, we were doing a lot of research on returns. Where have you returned items recently? How frequently do you return? So you can start to ask some of these questions based on the specific activity you're trying to learn more and solve for.
Beautiful. And okay, so let's say, I've run this research, I know a little bit more about the customer journey and their decision-making process. How do I take that into a place where, okay, now I design my own journey and how do I actually engage with this audience as they, go and then make their decisions?
Yeah, I think that's where you start with your measurement, right? So again, if kind of NPS or Net Promoter Score is your North Star, because you may be able to get some benchmarking on how other brands are performing, to say, okay, our goal is to increase NPS for checkout, as an example, by X percent. Then you can start to measure, are you making incremental improvements towards that goal based on features and functionality that you're rolling out. So maybe you don't have Apple Pay yet, or maybe you don't have PayPal, or maybe the way you do add to cart. So you start constantly testing and iterating and saying, does that improve add to cart rate? Does it improve conversion? And ultimately, those should ladder up into improving NPS. So it gives you a little more of a micro focus where you can balance where you're looking at, versus the older approach, which was, let's redesign everything at once. This gives you that very prescriptive focus and a quick way to tell if it's working or not.
I want to take us a little bit upper funnel for a second, and to exactly the place where you're mostly focused these days. So tell us a little bit more about social e-commerce and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think really from my perspective, we learned this early on at Intermix. A lot of our sales associates, for those of you not familiar with Intermix, it's a women's fashion brand in New York. We had about 30 to 40 stores selling contemporary primary fashion designers. We had amazing sales associates, and a lot of them were influencers in their own right. They could have 30, 40,000 followers. And we started to see this shift. While you go to Intermix because of the edit and curation, because you trust the styling associate in that particular store, you're also seeing them as an influencer and online. And then you have this entire ecosystem. You have celebrities getting into it. So you and I may look for different inspiration. I'm an avid runner, so I follow certain brands or runners online, and they may introduce me to a new product that I may want to try that I haven't thought about. It's like, that looks really cool, and they're running with it, so I may try it. So I think that's where you're starting to see that blending of content and commerce really start to take off within social channels. We all know a younger audience is participating in those channels as well. So by all means, doesn't say you should abandon everything else, but I do think you have that opportunity to sync up and leverage kind of that influencer network that exists in a more precise and prescriptive way than what we were talking about earlier, where you're just buying ad media dollars uploading a lookalike audience, crossing your fingers, hoping that creative resonates in 2 seconds, and then maybe you could do an attribution to see if it works.
And it's such hard work as well, right? It's sometimes, people think of, influencer marketing and sort of social media marketing, which is more organic. Wow, it will, take so much effort out of me. And it looks like paid advertising is like the easy win, but it really takes a lot of effort to win both, right? It's not like I need to delay the other because I need the quick wins first.
Yeah, and that's always the trade-off, and that's why you have a balance of your marketing tactics and efforts. Why we still rely, every brand I've worked with, we still rely heavily on email because it does work. You can still personalize it, you can segment it, create audiences, and it's relatively free.
Yeah.
Paid search is still a critical part of our ecosystem for media dollars. I just think shifting out of paid social from what we are talking about into influencer marketing will have much more value, and it really fulfills on that promise of going where your customers are. The hard part, as you alluded to, in the US, it's very, very fractured. You have TikTok, you have Snap, you have Pinterest, you have YouTube, you have Instagram and Facebook. Amazon's getting into the mix with live video and live streaming. So for a brand, it can be very, very daunting on how to participate across those channels. But you have to be there, and I think it's a more authentic and genuine way for a brand to show up if they're leveraging influencer marketing.
So what would you say would be the first step brands should take when they decide, okay, I'm now investing heavily on influencers and social and not only on paid? What would they need in order to get started?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Good question, by the way. I think it's like anything, test and learn. You really have to understand what metrics you're driving. I'm a big believer not everything has to equate to a pure conversion metric. So one of the areas is looking at audience acquisition, for example. So I believe you can now track more efficiently and effectively cost of customer acquisition through these channels. So if you target certain influencers, are they able to deliver a lower cost of acquisition? Can they drive more full price selling, a potential higher lifetime value of your audience? So that's one area I would start to test into. You can start to test certain influencers may perform better than others across those metrics and certain channels, and it will vary by brand. So I think on the acquisition side, that's one component. Awareness is another piece. You can run brand lift studies through YouTube based on video. Are you getting kind of a downstream effect? One of the good things I think with Google and YouTube is you have that entire ecosystem where you can run an awareness campaign on YouTube. You can trace it all the way through without a messy attribution model to see how it's performing in paid search, display, as well as shopping. So I think those are some of the pieces you should start to look at and measure, and then just continue to test and optimize.
Can paid social help influencer marketing work?
Yes, because I think you can boost some of the content that's created. That's one of the areas with the new company I'm with now that we're optimistic on. Why we think it's a benefit for some of the platforms as well is not only are we making the video shoppable, but you'll have the opportunity to continue to boost that content. I think for brands, that's one area you started to see this concept of boosting. So we may create this beautiful campaign imagery or content at Intermix for the launch of our spring or fall campaign, but we continue to boost that within our paid channels. So I think that's where you're starting to see them work a little more hand in hand versus trying to do the older format. The other challenge is to go back real quick. The good and the bad with paid social, especially Facebook for a while, was it was one of the few channels that could actually interrupt what you're doing, right? Because you didn't have intent to view an Intermix or a Theory or an Allison Olivia ad. You're just going through your Instagram feed or going about your day-to-day, and then suddenly there's a sponsored story or swipe up to shop. So I think that is really where you're seeing that shift. I could target you, whereas I can't now. You could debate on whether that personalized content's different, but with search and influencers, you have to have some level of intent.
Yeah.
because I'm already following someone that I really like or I'm passionate about or believe in. So I have that intent where I'm following that influencer for a reason, or I'm searching for a product for a reason, versus that older model of paid social where it's like, I'm just going to target you and cross my fingers that I can interrupt you enough to pay attention to my ad.
And we know, brands are doing everything they can to interrupt us enough. Yeah, creatives. It's another monster that needs to be fed.
Well, and I think that's where you're seeing kind of a reckoning for these ad models. And that's why everyone's racing to get into kind of commerce within these platforms. From a brand perspective, I still heavily believe, hopefully the audience picked up on that physical retail does still have a role. You and I chatted last week. I'm based in Soho in New York. And, when I go out for coffee at 2 or 3, I mean, the streets are busy. People are shopping because it's got that social component to it. People want to get out and shop. But for brands, driving that awareness and customer acquisition, those are always have been and will continue to be key challenges. It's just the tactics and execution are now shifting. And it's a lot harder and more expensive.
Yeah. And, we started talking about experience, and, it's exactly that. If my experience is not only buying stuff online, but also going outside to stores, to a shopping mall or whatever, this is part of my journey. So brands that want to interact with me probably need to be in different spaces, not only in one area, which is, very limited.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where you're seeing a lot of that shakeup, if you will, happen in the U.S. Because again, the older model for a brand, setting aside kind of these DTC native brands, was, hey, let's open a store on Fifth Avenue or Madison or whatever the hot shopping district is in these 24-hour cities, because that'll drive marketing. Someone will walk by the store. That's your awareness marketing. And suddenly that started to shift a little more to digital. Now you're seeing brands realize, okay, maybe that's not the best. Should we go where customers are? You see Nordstrom testing smaller footprint stores here in the U.S. with kind of their LA and New York small footprint to local instead of forcing them to drive to a mall. I think that's where you're seeing this whole ecosystem shift. And by the way, the local stores are highly, highly connected to e-com and digital.
Yeah. Isn't it the fact that right now in digital marketing happens a little bit what happened to Fifth Avenue, for example, because 10 years ago I could have a very small shop, some products I want to sell. It was easier for me to get to an audience that would like to buy them in relatively low cost. And today I need to be super sophisticated in terms of marketing in order to really get to this audience and pay even more.
Yeah, I just think there's more options, and that's the challenge when I was running digital marketing or marketing on the brand side, is really you have to be so precise and prescriptive on how you're mapping out that journey and touch points and where you want to focus your activities. Because before it was, you have a store, which once it was built, you'd have a 10-year lease. So then it really became traditional media, whether it was out of home, print, other publications you could look at. When e-commerce and digital marketing, you still had your big players, Facebook, but it was still that targeting and search and display. And then maybe we'll throw a little affiliate in there. But now you're starting to see that shift. And as we talked about, just with influencer, new platforms, there's so much that a brand has an opportunity to spend on, but you have to test and determine what works and understand the right revenue model. I think that's the biggest challenge we face as marketers. But again, I would say where I'm optimistic is just that test and learn approach, setting those KPIs and success metrics ahead of time, really understanding your margin flow through. So your CFO and financial team, you can build the case and say, we need to return 4 to 1 on every ad dollar we spend for retention, because our margin flow through is 25%. So that's our minimum threshold. Setting realistic cost of acquisition models and targets. And you just take a little bit of money and test it out. Can we achieve those goals? Great. Is it getting the expected result? Then how do we scale it? If it's not, then maybe we abandon and shift money elsewhere.
Very, very much true. If, after all these changes that happened now, on social and paid social and on social in general, what would be, the best tip you can give e-commerce brands that are looking to scale in the second half of this year?
Ooh, I would say a lot of what we talked about, but really making sure you have good, clean first-party data. And so taking a look at your site behaviors, your transactional data, making sure you have proper segments defined, and then setting goals and objectives across those segments. So I think that's the first thing, is just getting your data stack set up. And it doesn't have to be really, really complex. You don't have to build these models, but understanding, okay, what is our lifetime value? What is our spend frequency by segment? What audience do we absolutely have to protect and defend? And then where do we need to get our growth from? And growth doesn't always mean customer acquisition. It could be, if I get you to spend one more time, or maybe just stretch a little bit, instead of your average order value of $300 can get you to $320. So starting to look at it in that framework is I think how brands will win, because then you can layer in your marketing tactics and tests and see, okay, can we get you to spend $320 by using influencer marketing? Or maybe paid social still works in some cases.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure and so much value and knowledge. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. See you next time on Host the Pro. תודה רבה.